French Defence Minister has warned that Afghanistan is a trap for all countries with troops deployed there. Newly appointed Minister Alain Juppé says France wants to begin pulling forces out of Afghanistan by 2011 and will discuss its possibility at an upcoming NATO summit in Lisbon. However, he said France will not withdraw its forces until the Afghan government is ready to assume responsibility for security. Earlier in the day, NATO's civilian representative in Afghanistan said handing over security to Afghan forces could run way beyond a 2014 target date in certain areas. The US-led forces' exit from Afghanistan is said to be among priorities to be discussed when NATO leaders meet in Lisbon this week. Well, joining me on the phone from Atlanta, Georgia, is Cynthia McKinney. She is a former US Congresswoman. Welcome to the program. Mr. Alain Juppé has called the US-led war in Afghanistan a trap. To what extent do you think this view is shared by the United States?
Well, of course, I believe that there are some people inside the government of the United States who do believe that the war in Afghanistan is a trap. But unfortunately, they represent a minority position. But interestingly, if we can see the NATO coalition fall apart, we've already seen the announcement of the Dutch that they're leaving. The Canadians are leaving. Now the French say they're leaving. The British are leaving. So this NATO coalition can fall apart on its own from the pressures that are being placed on it from its own citizens. And, of course, eventually the United States will have to accept what many of us have known all along, and that is the coalition, in very much the same way that the coalition of the willing is basically a facade for, and the euphemism for U.S. military act of aggression.
Well, just does it seem that there is a conflict of ideas between the U.S. and France, or is there really, or are they really at odds with each other?
That's a very interesting question. In my opinion, I believe that the United States and France have more in common, particularly under the Sarkozy regime, than they have as differences. Of course, we understand that the French have a tradition of going their own way, and they at one point were separate and apart from the United States special relationship that it enjoys with, for example, the Great Britain. So there is this tradition, but under Sarkozy, I believe that given the tradition, but also given what we now know as the war on terrorism, that Sarkozy is closer to those planners inside the United States, particularly in the Pentagon, than he would be far away from them.
Recently, Mr. Obama was speaking of a exit strategy. Recently, Mr. Holbrooke said Washington is going to have a transition strategy, which is going to be unfolded in the NATO summit in Lisbon. What are we to understand from this transition strategy?
Of course, the United States will be looking for ways in which to exit with its head up. We now are hearing more and more rumblings, even from within our own establishment, that the war in Afghanistan is not winnable. The recent report from the Council on Foreign Relations, basically, which is as establishment inside the United States as you can get, basically came up with that conclusion. And so then that forces the question to be asked, well, what is it that the United States wants to gain from being there, and what is it that the United States has to achieve in order for it to leave there? That is the transition. How can the United States leave the region? What are the necessary ingredients for the United States to be able to leave and declare mission accomplished?
Well, recently Mr. Karzai gave a scathing interview criticizing the US and the presence of the troops in Afghanistan. A question comes to mind that how much are Mr. Karzai's words worth in the formulation of US policy, especially regarding Afghanistan?
Well, of course, Mr. Karzai's words are worth a lot, given that he owes his position to the United States. And so when Hamid Karzai speaks, then the United States must listen. At the same time, the United States also can find somebody else if Hamid Karzai continues to say the kinds of things that the policymakers inside the United States don't appreciate. Karzai has a very, very fine line to walk with his neighbor Pakistan, of course, Iran, China. There are regional issues that even a U.S. puppet has to understand and realize and respond to.
All right, so we'll have to leave it there. Many thanks to Cynthia McKinney, former U.S. Congresswoman, joining us from Atlanta there.